of the first projects that I worked on when I joined was to do a research project in Kenya to learn how mobile money took off. And so really excited that that philosophy is carried through the technology and up until today. So happy to impart some of that knowledge to you all. Denisse?
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Denisse. I've been at cLabs for over a year and a half now. I started out working very closely with Will on go-to-market, doing a lot of user research and bringing that spirit to cLabs. I recently joined the product team, so I focus specifically on the launch of cLabs mobile wallet called Valora, and I'm working more closely with the team. My background is in international development, did a consulting for international organizations like the World Bank, the UN and such, in Africa and Latin America, and then switched over to tech, where I've been working for the last 4 or so years doing international expansion. Yeah, so we will be sharing a little bit of what we've done at cLabs. We both work at cLabs, as you know, one of the first teams on Celo, and I want to share a little bit of the journey of user research or user focus at cLabs, and telling you a little bit about that. And then we're going to dive into some of the methods that we use that Will is going to walk us through. And so you can see what are different user research tools that are available for you to use during Celo Camp and to start exploring with. I do want this to be interactive, so feel free to interrupt us at any time. If you have questions, you can also put them in the chat, and I'll see how to see them, but maybe someone can just flag them or something. Okay. So Celo is an open platform that makes financial tools accessible to anyone with a mobile phone. So it's a really long definition and not one that the team got to very quickly. It takes a lot of understanding of what we're trying to solve and what the problems are and what we can provide to come to such definition. And user research and user focused conversations and just research in general is just such a big part of that. So how do we focus on Celos and users? And I put Celo here because when we started thinking about Celo as an ecosystem, Celo as a platform, Celo as a blockchain, not necessarily on for example, what I work on now, which is Valora, or the use of any particular part. We just started very, very broad. So our philosophy is always co-creating with the user, and that's what is at the center of user research. So understanding not only who our users are and what their problems or what problems we're trying to solve for them, or Celo is trying to solve for them, but also understanding what they care about, what they're benchmarking against, and how they differ across the world. So here you see users from our research trips in different parts. So on the left, we have Kenya, in the middle, we have the Philippines, and on the right, we have Argentina. So Will and I have really been all around the world doing user research to understand our users and the differences in them and on these user groups. Okay, so here's like a timeline of testing. We don't have to go into it in detail, but I just wanted to point out that we've been doing a lot of testing. This year, a little bit less because of COVID, but still we've been active. And so there's different types of research that we've been doing our testing. So we call it testing because there's different things you can test. You can test a hypothesis, you can test a definition like a user persona, you can test a product, you can test a prototype. So there's different things here. And so all the ones in white are research trips where we talk to users one-on-one or people that we think are potential users. The ones in green are pilots where we gave people the Celo wallet at the time, which now has become the basis for Valora, and had them use it and give us feedback through that. And then we have in blue a wildcard, which I will talk about a little bit more in detail in a few minutes, which was the Mexico Design-a-thon. So very different things, but the main takeaway here that I want to leave you with is that testing and user research is not like a one-time thing. I know during Celo Camp you're focusing on this week or maybe next week, but it shouldn't be just something you do once. It should be something that you do continuously, because you will evolve your understanding of your users. You will evolve, the problems that they're facing will also evolve. And like, it's important to understand different aspects of the different users that you're going to be serving. And so it shouldn't be a one-time thing. It should be a um, continuous task at hand, always talking to users. So how do you start, or what does the roadmap of continuous testing look like? And there's no one answer to this. This is like a diagram that we put together, just thinking a little bit of what our journey of testing and research has been at cLabs. We picked that starting point. Then we go broad, we explore and we diversify our research methods, we iterate. And then once we feel like we've iterated enough and we've done a lot of very different type of research and learned a lot of very different things, then we focus and then we refine and we continue testing and doing research to get really good at that thing that we've decided to focus on. So again, continuous process to do the research, but takes many different shapes and forms. So for us, we picked the starting point in Tanzania. The team, actually, Will was part of this research trip, went to Tanzania, invited by the World Food Program to do user research in a refugee camp. And they met Kaburu, who you see here. He moved to Tanzania from the DRC and has lived there for a really long time. And Kaburu has a family. He's a husband, he's a father, he is someone's son. And living in the refugee camp proved really, really difficult and complicated when it comes to like his and his family's financial needs. So like many people around the world, Kaburu does not have a form of formal ID as a refugee, and so he can't access basic financial tools. What does this mean? He cannot have a bank account in Tanzania where he lives. He also can't really use mobile money. Therefore doesn't have a way to save and in any form of like digital or non-digital financial service. He also fears of using cash to save. So a lot of people say, oh, let's just save with cash under the mattress. But living in a refugee camp is difficult and there's a lot of safety concerns. So that's also not available for him. And so this is kind of like a story of how we picked the starting point. We realized there's 1.7 billion people there's without access to bank accounts, and like a large share of them don't have access to formal IDs, but they still have financial needs. They need to be able to save, like in Kaburu's case, they want to be able to send and receive money across borders to their loved ones and doing that at an affordable rate. Like, as you see here, like transfer and remittance fees are super, super high. And so picking this as a starting point was like thinking, okay, how can we build a product that the 1.7 billion unbanked people around the world love and want to use and really solves their needs? So that's how we kind of like started narrowing down and picking a starting point. And we started early. The team went to Kenya. They did a lot of research and they started really broad. You see here Will with our colleague Asa in Kenya talking, like trying to understand how people charge their phones, right? As we know, Celo is a mobile first blockchain. And so having a smartphone is very important for end users to be able to reap the benefits of using this technology. And so understanding every aspect of how people use their mobile phones, not just for finances, but for everything, is really important to shaping how the blockchain works, how the applications layer work, and all of that. And another thing that was really interesting outcome of this trip is that people have mental models, right? So people in Kenya specifically are very used to using mobile money. And so developing a new product, whether it's Celo as a blockchain or Valora as an app or any of the projects that you're working on, won't exist in a vacuum. So understanding what the user sees as the alternatives is really a key part of doing user research. So you know what you're being benchmarked against and what experiences these users are familiar with. So there's two parts to this. One, which may seem very obvious, is like, oh, what's our competition? But then on the other hand, it's like, what user experience is the most familiar to the user so that you can start in a place where the user feels comfortable. You don't want them to have to change everything about how they charge their phone, for example, to be able to use the product. You want it to be as easy as possible to switch over. As I mentioned, we had this wild card in Mexico. So last year, I went to Mexico with some of the team, and we did a couple of different research projects. And one of them was a designathon. So we hosted this designathon at Laboratoria. Laboratoria is a boot camp for women who lacked access to quality education, and they provide a kind of like a fast track to becoming either a UX designer or a front-end developer, and therefore access the market for tech jobs in Mexico. And so it is a bootcamp with a strong mission. And with working with these 90 women who were part of the two cohorts at the time in the bootcamp, we worked on this designathon where we presented a challenge to them to design an app based on cryptocurrency to send money to their friends and loved ones. And so this was a full day event or even a 2-day event, I think. And we worked with these 90 women one-on-one. They worked in teams, of course, while they were hacking, but we were providing advice and a lot of education around Celo, and learned from how they saw us. Like we learned a lot and what they came up with, like their designathon solutions. We learned a lot of like how they envisioned our product to be in Mexico. And so it's not always just like doing the research and like doing the interviews. There are other ways to learn about what your users' preferences are. Defining the use cases. Here you see pictures from Batangas in the Philippines, where part of the team went to try out one of the use cases. We had this hypothesis that people would want to use the Celo mobile technology and the mobile wallet to pay. And so we established like this very small ecosystem where these participants you see here could use the Celo wallet at the time to pay. And we had a couple of merchants. And this was the first time that we had really merchants accepting payments with the wallet. And so it was a very different type of research. This was more like the pilot type. We already had a working product. And so we just learned by doing, or we learned by seeing people do, which was use the wallet. We learned from two different types of users here. So the purchasers or the ones using the wallet that you see, and also the merchants. It was the first time talking to merchants as well. And so that brought us to like defining the use cases. We tried out pay. We had heard that saving in Celo dollars would be a value proposition as well. And so we started thinking, okay, what are all the different things that our users have through the user research and all the different types of testing have kind of like told us they would be interested in exploring. And so we started like organizing all this information into the use cases. And so that then later on we could refine and go deep into one, like for example, we did with pay in the Philippines. So we then refined our tests and define, and it could be a dApp if you're building a dApp. In our case, it was Valora. Here you see Brian, who was a participant in our Earn pilot in Kenya early this year. And there we tested a very specific use case, which was the idea of doing micro work from your phone and using the Celo network to get paid very quickly for this work. And so we refined the test. We did a much narrower thing, focus on one of the use cases to really understand the profile of that specific user for that use case. And so this is where we started iterating again and like focusing down. And one thing that I also wanted to mention to you, sorry for the background noise, if you hear that's an airplane, don't do it alone. So there's a community always out there that is willing to help out, and it can be with like helping out with user research or like just sharing their experience. Here you see Prosper last year, the first time Prosper took place, which was in person in California. It wasn't really user research. You could call it expert interviews, but it was just all these people that were part of the ecosystem, and you have this community as part of the Celo camp. Talk to each other, like learn from others what they have learned about how to use blockchain for good, or how to use the Celo platform to deliver positive impact or to solve the problems that you're trying to solve. You don't always learn everything from like your obvious user. You may learn things from each other as well. So I wanted to bring that here. And to just close up this section is like, how do you change the world? You change the story. This is Charles Einstein, one of the advisors of Salo. And so changing the story is something that you do together with your users. So if you're trying to help, in this case, Rosa, an entrepreneur in Mexico, if you want to like solve a problem for her or for Kabur in Tanzania, change the story with them, like let them like not just tell you what they need, but also like help you shape that. And so it will be much more gratifying also when you are ready with your solution to like be there to celebrate that with them. So keeping close ties with these people is always very enriching. So with that, I'll pass it on to Will.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Denisse. So Denisse talked a bit about the why we do user research. And so in this next section, I'd love to dig a little bit deeper into the how and talk about a couple popular user research methods. And similarly, I invite you to interrupt me with any questions. I would love this to be interactive. So don't be shy. Next slide. So kind of before we start into the how, I think it's important to kind of to figure out why we're doing this. I encourage everyone to dig deep, right? I think what is really interesting is humans, there's a lot of research that shows humans are really bad at figuring out what they want or what makes them happy. And so when you are investigating different tools, especially when you're investigating a new application or a new technology, asking people what they want is sometimes insufficient. And so the root of really good design research gets to the how and the why. Like, what is driving that motivation? Why do they want this thing? And oftentimes, if you understand the nugget behind the why, you're better able to build tools and solutions and features that are resonant and delightful for your end user. Next slide. So before we start figuring out the exact tool, I think it's important to kind of understand what is your research question. This is the first step and honestly one of the most important ones. Identifying a really crisp research question, I think, is going to be key to figuring out how to design your research plan. So I encourage folks to be specific. So for instance, some of the research questions that we've used to jumpstart our research plans in the past have been, which market do we want to enter first? Who is our key audience? And sometimes they are testing out a specific feature, like does the account recovery option that we have built, does that work for most people? But the important thing here is to be as crisp and specific as possible. Like something more generic or general, like will people like this? Could work, but might lead you in several different directions. The next point I'd like to point out is identifying your audience is really, really important. Thinking about your user is key. There's a concept that is quite popular called mainstreams and extremes. And so what most people do is identify the average user for their product, right? Like, oh, the average user looks like this profile. When I do my research, I should make sure to reach out to those folks and include them in the research study. That's important. But I also encourage you to think through the extremes. So people who are going to be power users, and then people maybe on the margin, and including those in your research as well to make sure that your solution has broad appeal. I'll give you an example of why that's important. When we were doing some research, like on paper, we were looking at the Philippines as a launch market, and in a lot of this, kind of bandwidth test that we had done ahead of time showed that we had around, on average, 8 megabytes per second of download speed. And when we tested 8 megabytes per second as download speed, this Valora app worked fine in that version. But when we actually went on the ground in the Philippines, we saw that even though 8 was the average, the bandwidth download speeds would vary between 3 and 12% or something like that, right? And so at 3%, things would actually work pretty poorly. And so the average oftentimes obscures the reality on the ground. And so having that kind of broader view is important. The third tip, as you kind of think through this, is to think ahead. I always say, think how your answers to your research will change your actions. And if you're not going to do anything different based on the answers to your research, then it begs the question, why are you asking the question, right? So like if you have a question like, which launch market will we enter? Obviously, hopefully your research plan will define the launch market. But if your answer to your research is like, we should do more research, then it might be worth reevaluating or redesigning your research plan to make it more action oriented, to make it more kind of impactful. And the last thing is choose your research plan, like choose the tool that is right for you. You have tons of tools at your disposal. No one is perfect and they all have different pros and cons. And so it's important to kind of work backward from like the, what are you trying to figure out, to the, like, how do I do this? Does that make sense? Any questions so far? Cool. Next slide then.
I have a question. Would you mind giving an example of some of the research questions that you used?
Yeah, of course. So one question that we had, and this was a kind of a broader question, and that we used to design a pilot, was how might we make it easy for anyone to use a mobile phone to earn crypto, right? And then that kind of formed the pilot design. Another question, like I said, was what is the, like, how can we improve the app to create a merchant experience? And that's how we kind of designed the Philippines pilot project. There could be some specific questions too, but like there was one about incentives that we looked at, like what is the right level of incentives or referral bonuses that we need in order to generate demand. And we were able to kind of do some testing at different levels of incentives to kind of see what that would be in terms of demand as an impact. Yeah, Denisse, do you have other ones you want to add?
I think we had always a lot of questions about the user, like how may we make it easy for a non-tech savvy user to use a mobile phone to make payments. So thinking about the user experience is also something that is a very good starting point.
We did a really cool one on onboarding, which was like, hey, let's go walk through the onboarding process step by step and see where the highest drop-offs are. And we designed a project that way. And so yeah, I mean, like, I think again, being as crisp and specific as possible is good for designing your research question. But good question. Next slide.
Sorry, one more question there, Will. For how will the answers affect your course of action? Do you formulate hypotheses like I don't know, if we provide X app, our users will do Y, or this will be more effective? Or how would you think of the possible answers that will impact your future journey?
Yeah, good question. So I think it's what I meant by this point is there are often tons of questions that you can ask and tons of things you can prioritize. And I would prioritize figuring out the answers to questions that have immediate impact to your roadmap, right? So I'll give you a hypothetical. If your product roadmap is really full and you don't have any bandwidth to like change up your account recovery option in the short term, then it might not make sense to prioritize that as a question, right? If you're trying to figure out a question about, for instance, we actually had as part of our roadmap in the future something around community currency, which I think is really interesting and a lot of people really want to kind of figure out. But from a technical perspective, that is like a year beyond. And so those research questions or pilots or projects that we could design are just not as important in the short term. The more important ones are the ones that like have immediate kind of impact based on like which launch market are we going to? What are the specific features that our early users will need in order to make it successful? Does that answer your question?
It does, thank you.
I would also add that there's a lot of actions that come out of this research that are kind of like, you could call them workarounds, but if you know you don't have bandwidth to change your product based on the findings of a research study, there's still other things you can do, like workarounds with ops or with support. So for example, when we did the onboarding study about like onboarding into Valora, we realized, okay, for this type of user, we're going to have support to walk them through step by step the onboarding process so that we can increase the success rate of that onboarding. So though you don't have time or bandwidth in your product roadmap to change the onboarding experience, you can complement it with like user support and other workarounds like education and so on.
Yeah, sure. Awesome. Maybe next slide, Denisse. But I love these questions. Please keep them coming. Yeah, so like I said earlier, there are so many tools that you can use for user research, so many different methods. Um, what I often see sometimes is teams, what is that line? Like when all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Um, let's not fall into that trap. I think we all have a lot of tools at our disposal and they are good for different reasons. And so figuring out what specific question you want to use and then working backward to design the tool or to implement the tool that works best is the approach I would encourage you to use. The three tools, I'll go through these all in detail, but the three tools I would love to dive into in more detail are surveys, user interviews, and pilots. These are the ones that we use most commonly and I think are very powerful for different reasons. But I think you also should augment them with secondary research. Like I think that's a great way to get a baseline understanding of the landscapes and what's kind of out there. Demand tests are great at kind of like figuring out what people actually want. So demand tests are like, hey, I'm gonna put a fake ad on Facebook and see how many people click through. What's nice about that is sometimes self-reported information is biased or inaccurate, and demand tests are a way to get more kind of real data, but they are kind of expensive. And generally, focus groups have kind of fallen out of vogue in the user research space. People are hating on focus groups a bit more now, but they are sometimes important. I think the key thing about focus groups is if you have an in-group, like a type group of people that you're not part of, say like doctors, for instance, and they have a way of speaking to each other that is different than they would speak to a non-doctor, having a focus group can be really nice because people feel more casual and more comfortable speaking like that. But I think for the most part, user interviews have taken over as the more common way to get qualitative information from a large group of people. But yeah, let's dive into the first three actually. So if you go to the next slide, I love surveys. Surveys are a great way to kind of get a lot of information and they're very versatile, right? And so I'll go through some tips quickly and then go into like why and how you should use surveys. First off, like make every question count. Like every single question should be impactful. I think nobody wants to kind of go through long surveys. The longer the survey, the less people will pay attention and the more your data will suffer. And so every single question should be vetted and you should ask yourself, how will I use this data in this survey, right? And if you're not going to be using this data for something tangible, then you might consider getting rid of it. Keep it short. I mean, like, I think I don't really have a rule of thumb for how long surveys are. I think it depends on like who you're surveying, what you're offering as an incentive, but the shorter, the better. Be clear and direct. So again, like it's important to really make sure that you're asked, like the wording of a survey question makes such a big difference in how people respond. That's why things like referendums go through so many like iterations and like back and forth about how to phrase questions. So I would try to like test it with a friend or run it through people just to make sure that you're asking what you're intending to ask. And also avoid introducing bias, right? So there's always a tendency to kind of try to say things like, you know, Celo is often viewed as a really innovative blockchain. Like, do you agree with this statement? Like that is a pretty leading question. And if you're really intending to kind of try to do research and not be misleading, then you should reconsider how you phrase certain things. Right, so those are some tips, but some of the things that we've used surveys for, like, I mean, it varies widely. So to the point earlier about trying to identify a launch market, one thing that we did was we created a pretty short survey and deployed it to like 10 or 15 different countries and tried to use that kind of information to see which country might be the most receptive to having a Celo solution deployed. That wasn't the only factor into our decision, but it was an important one because it kind of gave us almost an apples to apples comparison for a lot of people very quickly, right? We used surveys in the past too to screen for pilot participants. So sent out like a 5-question survey to make sure that they were the right folks, that we would have like a diverse representation in our group. We've also used surveys to track changes over time. And so like if we wanted to, we tested out like different forms of user education and tried to see which one was more effective. And so we sent out a baseline survey beforehand to see how folks responded to certain questions. And then at the end, to basically see which treatment of the education was more effective. So tons of different ways to use surveys. I will say one thing that surveys are bad at is getting to like the deeper level qualitative question, right? Like it's good at asking the what, but because there's no follow-up, because there's no space for creativity, you sometimes miss things that you don't know. And B, there's not this opportunity to kind of dig into the why as much, right? Like most surveys don't have that kind of free form option to fill things in for good reason. And then, so I would recommend that you augment any user research or surveys you do with other user interviews. So next slide. Any questions on surveys? Cool. Maybe next slide, Denisse. So yeah, user interviews. This is one of my favorite ways to get to interact with the end user. And you actually don't need to do a lot of them. There was like a research study that happened that showed that by doing between 8 and 10 user interviews, you can get to like 95% of reported user needs. And so it drops off pretty quickly. But 8 to 10, I think, would be a nice minimum for folks if you really want to get to a very comprehensive view. Obviously, these are a bit more involved and a bit more intensive, but very, very powerful to get to that why that we talked about earlier. And so some things to think about before you get into a user interview, like have a plan, have like a question guide that you have written out beforehand. Use that as a guide, not a script. So, I mean, like let the conversation flow as you want, but definitely having that kind of list is a really good way to make sure that you are kind of tracking to your existing plan. This might seem a little bit hand-holdy, but I would love to kind of talk to you kind of our process for user interviews. It's very formalized and you can always adapt it, but I recommend kind of having some baseline just to kind of have a sense for what to do. But in general, we like to have it around 2 people, at least 2 people on the solo side for user interviews. One is the lead interviewer that kind of walks through the questions, and one is the note taker. The reason being is it's actually really hard to have an engaging conversation with somebody and take notes at the same time. It's pretty challenging because you break up the rapport a little bit, you lose track of the questions. And so we found that having both is great. And on top of that, it gives you an opportunity to debrief and discuss immediately after, which I think kind of solidifies some of the insights and findings you have from your interview. So yeah, we have a lead interviewer. They sit very close to the interviewee and they have a conversation. The note taker tries to write down things almost as verbatim as possible. And that is to avoid having bias being introduced, right? And you also want to have quotes to back things up. And so that's what the note taker's role is. If there's a translator, the translator will also be there. And I would instruct the translator to try to translate the conversation as honestly and accurately as possible and not to introduce bias. And so one thing that translators often do is you want to make sure the interviewee and the interviewer are having a conversation with each other, and that's just facilitated by the translator and not having a conversation through the translator, if that makes sense. And so the translator shouldn't say things like, oh, he said this, blah, 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 blah. She said that, blah, 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 blah. The translator should kind of almost like even say things like, I like this feature of the app. I know it's very kind of nitpicky, but it does make a difference in order to build the rapport between the interview and the interviewee. And then if you have a photographer, I think that's great. We have a lot of photographers too, just to kind of document and keep track and to build collateral. One thing I would recommend that is nice is at the end of the interview, the photographer shows the photos that they've taken and gets sign off from the interviewee just to make sure that they're okay with using those photos. Next slide. Yeah, I'll go through this pretty quickly, but there's like different parts of the interview. I think one of the things that people forget a lot is the rapport building, and that is very important. Like, just don't jump right into the interview. I think you have to put yourself in the context of the user. People are not used to being interviewed. So there's like a level of kind of apprehension and anxiety that happens at the beginning. And so I would spend the first 5 to 10 minutes just like asking easy questions about their family, about their life, kind of building that rapport. And you would find that like once you open up a little bit, if you invest that time, the rest of the interview goes so much more smoothly. And so that's kind of the big thing here. just don't skimp on the relationship building. Yeah, next slide. Some really quick tips for the interview process. Ask open-ended questions, right? Don't ask leading questions. So things like, do you think that this feature is too difficult? I think there's always this natural tendency for people to agree with you or try to give you the answer that you want to hear. That is just a natural human bias. And so this is actually sometimes very cultural too. So I remember when I used to live in Kenya, and one of the things that I realized was that when people didn't know the answer to a question, they would often try to give you the answer that they thought you wanted to hear. So if you asked, like, is the store that way? Even if they weren't sure, they would say yes. And so the better way to ask a question is, which way is the store? So that you can have a more honest answer that way. So similarly with user interview questions, you want it to be open-ended as possible and non-leading as possible. A good way to do that is to ask follow-ups. You don't have to kind of make it fancy. You can just say, can you tell me more? Can you say more? And oftentimes people will elaborate, and that's when you get to like really interesting insights. Speak the language of the interviewee. And so this is actually a great tip that was taught to me at IDEO, but like you want people to feel comfortable, and you don't necessarily want to correct them unless it's important or necessary. And so like if your interviewee calls the Atlantic Ocean the Pacific Ocean in your follow-up questions, you should also call the Pacific Ocean. Can just speak their language. And last, again, don't insert your thoughts or opinions. Like this is about them. Try not to kind of be too leading or biased. Because the whole reason you're doing this is to try to empathize a lot more with your end user. Next slide. I think that's all I had for interview tips. Do you want to talk about pilots, Denisse?
Yes, I will very briefly talk about pilots because this is like the most complex form of research that I think will list it out. We've done a few of them, actually a lot of them. So I did want to touch upon them, but I want to focus on like why I am like telling you like be careful with them. It's a lot. It takes a lot to like plan a pilot to execute it. So a lot of the things that we've talked about in this session is about design, right? Like or like hypothesis. What are you trying to test and planning for like this is what I want to learn, these are my hypotheses, and so on. But there's just so much more when you're trying to do a pilot. So the time to do a pilot is when you have a working prototype that you want to get feedback on, specifically on that prototype and like the experience of the user with a prototype. That means you already know the user, you already know what you're trying to solve for, you already have the product defined, and you're just trying to improve on the experience in the product. So pilots are very complex in the planning phase. So this is like when you start thinking about doing a pilot, you should think about like why you want to do a pilot. What are you trying to learn from putting a product or an experience in front of users and getting feedback on that? The scope, I think pilots can get out of like have this gigantic scope really quickly. And as Will mentioned, for user interviews, the same counts for pilots. You do not need 400 participants in a pilot to learn like the 5 key insights that you're going to get. Maybe just having 20 might be enough. Maybe even doing like a very brief like kind of demo day situation with 10 people might be enough to learn what you're looking to learn. In planning, you also want to consider any partners and the timeline and your budget, of course. Pilots, again, can be really expensive, especially in the case of, for us at cLabs, we always go in country to do the pilot before COVID. So we want to be as close to as possible to our users. And so the travel costs can be really high and so on. Then when you're designing, so you define what you want to learn, like you've scoped out your pilot, you have like your target user audience, so you have some sort of relationship where you're going to recruit participants to your pilot, right? You move on to the design, and that's where you like lay out your hypotheses, you define what success means, and in success criteria, that's where you include the impact. So success criteria will say, okay, I consider this pilot to be successful if this and this and this happened, but also what is the consequence from it? Like I will alter my product roadmap, or I will like make sure that I can take the learnings from the pilot and implement them, whether it's through product or through ops or any other way. You want to test a lot in the design phase. So if you're trying to set up like a merchant system, like we did in the Philippines or in Mexico last year. You want to test this out before. You don't want to show up in country ready to launch a pilot with like 20 people waiting to start using this app and nothing works, right? So you want to be testing everything in the comfort of your homes or your office or your co-working space before. And think about user support. So even though this is a pilot and you may have even a very close relationship with your pilot participants during the pilot or from interactions before, they will need a lot of support because they have never used your app before, they have never used your product before, and it is a new experience. And so they will expect to be steered and handheld throughout the process. So plan for that. It's very, very important because you want the pilot participants to also have a good experience. They're likely to become your first evangelists and advocates once you launch. So you wanna have that positive experience. And then execution. For us, when we were piloting with Valora, onboarding is like the toughest part of becoming a Valora user. So we put a lot of emphasis on that, providing the education that is needed and like understanding what the experience is going to be in country, depending on like connectivity and other parameters. Engagement, so making sure the pilot participants are always excited and engaged with your product and they are providing feedback consistently, not just during like user research, right? So as part of our pilots, we always include like a research plan. So we do one-on-one interviews with most pilot participants, but we want that feedback to be continuous. So we always have the user support set up. So we have office hours, we have like a WhatsApp or a messenger group where they can just let us know if they're experiencing a bug. And so we can get the feedback immediately, and it's a very tight loop. And then measuring, how you're going to measure your success criteria, and offboarding. That's part of that, the pilot experience, pilot participant experience. You want to celebrate like the conclusion of the pilot and thank them for all the feedback that they have provided. So like thinking about how you're going to like close that off is also super important. To sum up, there's a lot of pieces to it. I know Salo Camp, you are just in week 3. So I feel like pilots is something maybe for the future once your products are more ready. But just know that going into it, it's a lot more work than any of the other tools that we listed before. Do you have any questions about pilots? Do let me know.
Just one question from, oh, sorry, go.
Yeah.
Sorry, Renata. I wondered, because we're about to actually do some pilot testing. When you said to user support means you're effectively hand-holding the participants in the pilot, how do you ensure that you're not making things too easy, I guess, is what I mean, given that it's a digital product and you want people to be able to presumably onboard themselves ultimately? Is it just about narrowing your hypothesis so that you're not sort of making things too easy? Does that make sense?
It's about narrowing the objective. So which part of the product experience are you looking to get feedback on? If it's on onboarding, you should let them do that on their own. But if you're trying to get their feedback on like transactions, so onboarding is not the main objective of your pilot, then you might support them more through like this tougher onboarding phase so that they don't have a first experience that is really bad that could then like kind of taint their transaction experience, which is what you're actually looking to learn about.
Got it.
Example from our past experience, that onboarding kind of pipeline hypothesis that we had, what we did there was on our first iteration, we made it self-serve. And so it was very representative of how people would onboard at first. And after we like gave them a chance and watched some people fail, then we kind of came in and helped those people who failed and then move them to the next phase. And so that way we were able to get the data and the signal of like which was the most difficult, and then also make sure that they were included and held their hand a little bit more. And so there are ways to do that and answer your question, but also not kind of create a terrible pilot experience for your participants.
What I would add
Thanks.
there is also that you should think that once your product is launched, if people need help, they're going to go either to their friend who's already using the product or to a call center or to whatever support FAQ page or forum you may have, right? So in a pilot, if people need help, they will seek it out as well. So you should make plans for that, because even in like once the product is available broadly, like people need help, they will seek it out. So it shouldn't be any different during a pilot.
Yeah, okay. Good answers, thank you.
There's another question?
Yes, hi. My question was, in testing with a small group, as you mentioned, Denise, and trying to get, I guess, more qualitative feedback there, how would you think that the pilot is different from, say, a focus group or an interview with a little product? Just to understand the differences.
Yeah, in a focus group, people are sitting together. So if you ask your interviewee a question, interviewee B will also hear that answer. And so that's why it creates groupthink, like Will mentioned. With pilots, you are usually like giving them the product and like sending them out there to use it in whichever micro ecosystem you created, but they're not like using it all at the same time. So they're having a more real world experience. With focus groups, it's a lot about conversation and questions. It's kind of like a guided interview or something like that. And because it's groups, it's not like they're out there on their own using your product. With a pilot, you try to replicate that a bit more.
Perfect, thank you.
Great. So again, just to wrap up, pilots are one of the many tools that you have to help you validate your hypotheses. So if you're thinking about piloting, ask yourself, why is this question worth answering? Like, why do you need to pilot? What experience exactly are you trying to get feedback on? And how is it going to impact either my product roadmap or my ops roadmap and other things? So that's also how are you going to act differently. So if you learn that your product is not well received and nobody understands it, you need to have like the kind of lack of ego to say like, okay, I need to go back to the drawing board and start from scratch and like redesign everything. So just be ready for that, because it wouldn't be unheard of that once you bring your product to users, like you have to change everything about it. And then just are there simpler ways to answer these questions, whether it's through user research, providing maybe like the app for someone to doing a one-on-one interview and then giving you feedback as they're onboarding, instead of having like 20 or 100 people participate in a pilot. So if you're looking to get feedback on a very small part of the experience, then organizing a whole pilot may not be worth it. So these are some of the questions to ask yourself. That's it. Any other questions about pilots or anything that we covered in this presentation?
Oh, just a quick plug. So one of the things that we're working on right now is Denisse and I are developing a pilots and research toolkit. And so a lot of these findings and resources, some templates from our surveys, some templates from our pilot planning process, interview guides, they'll be compiled and made public, hopefully within a month, but don't like hold me to it. We have a pretty busy roadmap here. And so we'd love to share it with the community. And so you'll have these resources. And yeah, I mean, I'm also happy to answer any questions if people reach out to me. So.
Hello, thank you very much for the presentation and everything. One question that I had was, for surveys, should you be trying to send those out to people that you would want to be your intended users, or should you just try to get as many people as you can to fill them out?
Yeah, I think this goes back to the research question. Like everything, I know this is going to be kind of a common answer, but it all kind of stems from what you're trying to figure out, right? And so let me give you a hypothetical. If your question is like, who will like this product, or what is the broad appeal of this more generally, I think having like a wider audience could be really nice for your surveys, because it might surprise you. It might be like, hey, college students really like this, and I didn't expect that. And so that's also helpful. If you're really trying to get feedback on a specific feature, sending it out to your potential users, I think makes a lot more sense, right? Because those are the feedback that you would care about more. And so I think it depends a little bit.
All right, thanks. That sounds good.
I would also add there, like I've seen a lot of teams that are trying to do research for the first time send out the survey to like their classmates or people that are exactly like them. These are not your users. These are just your friends. So try to cast a wide net. And so you're going to be learning from like very different user profile or potential user profiles. Don't just go to like your easy access, like friends and family group.
That actually, sorry, that what you just said raise another question that I was thinking along the way. You would have had, I mean, certainly not only spanning different cultures, but also you had merchants and spenders in the Philippines, right?
That's right.
Right. So were you, sorry, were you seeking different insights from merchants as opposed to spenders? Because obviously their needs would be, did you consider their needs to be different, and did you conduct your research accordingly?
Definitely. So as part of that project, we had almost parallel research plans. So we had an interview guide for our like consumers, and we had an interview guide for our merchants as well.
Right. Thanks.
I see there are some question in the chat from Liam. Liam, do you do closing interviews or surveys when you offboard? So Will and I tried make a research plan at the beginning of a research trip or a pilot, and we include usually a mix of methods. So we always do a onboarding survey because that gives us a lot of details about the group that we're working with. We do interviews one-on-one because we get a lot of qualitative insights, and we do offboarding. It's usually a survey because we've already done a one-on-one interview. But if you haven't done that, doing an offboarding interview could be interesting. One thing to consider is that the more participants you have, the interviews can take a really long time. It's not just like the time to interview, which should be like 45 minutes to an hour, but also the time to debrief with the team after the interview to really distill those insights. So you should plan about like 2 hours per interview.
One more tip on like offboarding surveys is now that we've done a ton of different pilots and research projects, we found that it's helpful to have like common questions in some of our onboarding and offboarding surveys, which lets us compare more apples to apples across these cohorts. And so like some of those questions are like, would you recommend, like on a scale 1 to 10, would you recommend a Valora to a friend or something? And then that, since if you're going to do like regular research projects in series, having those kind of common threads is helpful to kind of show how successful one was versus the other, how things have changed over time. And so that's a nice tip to kind of keep throughout.
There's a question about time limits for surveys from Chakra. I think for surveys, like the moment you send it out, that's the most you're gonna get most responses quickly. You should send out reminders, but after like a week or so, like people, if they didn't answer, they're not likely to answer. If it's part of like a bigger project where you've recruited participants, whether it's in a research study or in a pilot, usual participants for this type of research get compensated with like a kind of like a thank you gift card or some sort of like thank you gifts. So you can make it a requirement that they complete like the different parts of your user research. So when we do pilots, for example, we always give people a thank you gift at the end. And so they know that to receive a thank you gift at the end, they need to have completed the onboarding survey, the one-on-one interview, and like a couple of other parameters. So if you're doing like more than a just one-time interaction with a potential user, it's very useful to set out the expectations clearly of like what you're expecting them to do and what they're going to get in return. If they're volunteers, of course, you should expect them to do less. But if they're like getting a thank you gift or a bonus for participating, then you can expect more.
Thank you. I have a question regarding demand test. William, could you give an example about it?
Yeah. So one example was we wanted to test out different ads and which ad message was the most effective and what combination of like copy and image would be very interesting. And so that process was actually kind of multi-step. The first thing we did was in Denisse's research in Mexico, she showed people different like slogans and pictures and had them do more like qualitative to piece together things that were interesting. We found, I don't remember the exact insight, but we found things like people like faces more and like this sort of emotional messages. And we were able to narrow down some of our potential ad images into like, I don't know, 3 different versions. And then we basically bought Facebook ads to our target cohort of people and measured the like click-through rate of each of these ads to see which one was the most effective. And the nice thing about that was, you know, people can say like, oh, I like this image, but you don't know for sure unless there's actually a real behavior measuring. And so that was how we were able to narrow down the ad that we wanted to use And to the point about like how we're going to do things differently, this is an expensive marketing campaign that we were going to run. So it helped us inform what we were going to put our money against in terms of the ad copy.
Okay, thank you, guys.
I think that's all the time we have for today. Will and Denisse, thank you so much. This was really incredible, and perhaps we can continue the conversation in our Discord channel. And I'll add you both there, and whenever you have time, if anybody has questions, then that would be great. I do have just a few quick announcements for everyone. When you join these meetings, it would be really helpful if you put your team name next to your personal name, so we can see who's on here. And also, it's just easier for communication between each other. Deliverable 3 is due by the end of the week, and if you have not completed deliverable 1 and 2, please complete it by the end of this week as well. Most of you have, but some of you have not. So if you can do all that this week, that would be great. I'll be introducing you to your mentors today in your Discord channels, which is why it's really important for you to complete and update your team pages. Please be proactive in saying hello to your mentor and helping set up the meeting. You will receive a mentor guide via email as to how to best maximize your time with your mentor, such as choosing 3 things you'd like to focus on and to discuss with your mentor. And that's all I have for announcements for today, but stay tuned for some more emails, and I look forward to seeing you all at our Prosperous session on Thursday. So if you have any questions, reach out to me via your Discord channel. And thank you everyone for joining today. Will and Denisse, that was awesome. So I'm so happy we got to do this and spend time with you. So thank you so much.